Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the last session of the day. And of course, our presentation is It's Legal, Now What? Cannabis and Medical Marijuana. So before I get into introductions, let me just pause for a moment here and let's talk about the title. We came up with It's Legal, Now What? Simply because cannabis has been legalized in so many states. Um, we just as easily could have come up with the title It's Legal, or is it? Because it is actually somewhat of a gray area of the law where we're dealing with both federal legislation as well as state legislation. So we're going to delve into that. We're going to talk about what type of ramifications that might have. Sort of interesting. The title, though, we did land on is legal. Now what? Simply because the vast majority of states have come up with some form of cannabis that is considered legal, either for recreational or medicinal use or both. It's interesting. Michael Wynn, one of the pharmacists at My Matrix and myself, published a paper probably over a decade ago now, before a lot of discussion was occurring regarding the use of cannabis in workers' compensation. And our position at that time was that we should slow down this legalization process at the state level. Let's examine it scientifically, and let's make some decisions based on scientific evidence. Well, those days have passed. We are well beyond that. There's no longer a debate about whether or not states should legalize it. The vast majority have legalized some form, so we're well past that. But then the title was extended a little bit to include the phrase cannabis and medical marijuana. Now, that in and of itself is an interesting phrase because cannabis and marijuana are the same thing. There's no difference between those two. However, myself personally, and I know a lot of clinical colleagues that are doing the same thing, prefer the term cannabis. Marijuana actually has some negative connotations associated with it, and it is a uniquely, primarily an American phrase. And there are individuals that take offense to the use of that word. Cannabis is more of one, it is the scientific name of the plant, and it is also more of an internationally accepted name. So when we put cannabis and medical marijuana in the same title, I find that interesting because they are the same thing, other than that distinction in the use of the phrase. Also find it interesting to call out medical marijuana. The only difference between recreational marijuana and medical marijuana is the intent of the user. In other words, if someone is intending to use it for recreational purposes, um, they're using the same plant as someone in most cases that is intending to use it for medicinal purposes. Now, there are varieties of the plant that have lower THC levels, and we're also going to talk about that a little bit today. So, with the introduction explained in that way, let's get on introductions. My name is Phil Walls. I'm a pharmacist and chief clinical officer for My Matrix. I've been with the company almost from the start. And as I said, I've seen a lot of things develop, including the fact that, we've revisited our research on cannabis on multiple occasions now. Uh, Cliff, may I ask you to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Phil. My name is Cliff Beliveau. I'm a data geek and vice president of business analytics at My Matrix.
Thank you, Cliff. So I'm going to take a little over first half of the presentation, and then I'm going to hand it off to Cliff to actually talk about some of the data that we have that we've been looking at, and again, what that might mean to you. So let's start off with a polling question, just to sort of set the stage today. Very simple. Is medical cannabis legal in your state? Over on the right-hand side of the screen, I think you're going to see where the polling question pops up. And Cliff, if I could ask you to make sure I describe that in the right way, let people know how they can respond.
Well, we're up to 2 votes, 100%. We never set a bet on this, Phil, before we did this, what the percentage breakout would be. For still 100%. So I see there's some vested interest in this presentation.
Okay, so that's the perfect place to start then. So 100% of the respondents are saying that it's legal in their state of residence. That doesn't surprise me because all but 3 states have legalized it in one form or another. at the state level.
Mhm.
This is a very interesting place that we've come to with regard to the use of a very powerful drug. Last year, probably about the same time, I was talking to Dr. Marcos Iglesias about this, and he posed the question to me, you know, Phil, what if states took this to the next level? And the next time a drug comes out to treat something, cancer, for instance, and the FDA is very slow in approving that drug, or perhaps they decide not to approve it, are we going to actually start taking drugs like that to the state level to vote on? And he and I both agreed, we certainly hope not. We don't expect it to be that way. But is this approval process for cannabis that unique? Because at the end of the day, what we have to consider, and going back to the title, it's legal or is it, begs the question of what is the federal government going to do? So let's talk about some of the laws and legislation. So first of all, state level. For the record, I hate presenting maps like this because as rapidly as the landscape has been changing with regard to cannabis legalization, these maps go out of date very, very quickly. So if you're interested, I would refer you to the website where we took this from. It's posted at the bottom of the slide, and stay up to date that way, because I expect this to continue to change as state legislation changes. But as you can see, the vast majority of states have legalized it in one way or another. Let's talk about the state level legalization. Over the last decade, I've seen the state level approach happen in another very significant area that also has an impact on workers' compensation, and that is with the state prescription drug databases that have been developed, typically known as a PDMP. So all states now, Missouri is still handling it a little bit differently. They're handling it more sort of at a county level, but all states have some form of a state prescription drug database in place for physicians to monitor what are considered to be dangerous drugs, typically controlled substances, before they prescribe for a patient. I find it very interesting that the same governors that were signing these PDMP programs into law are the same governors that have been signing cannabis into law. Now, I find it interesting because there's no requirement for cannabis use to be reported to the state database. Why? Because it is not a prescription drug. And as long as it's illegal at the federal level, cannot be a prescription drug. Now, I do want to call out one state, and there may be others, but this is one that I'm very familiar with. That is the state of Connecticut. State of Connecticut, I think, was very smart in that they developed a card program for any approved cannabis user in their state, and that card program is tied to the state prescription drug database. So that way a prescriber can at least see when he or she is considering prescribing an opioid or any controlled substance, they know if that individual is also legally has access to cannabis in their state. So wise choice. Another state that I want to call out, and then a little bit later on, I'm going to circle back to also for what I consider to be best practices, is Minnesota. The program that Minnesota developed, I find to be very, very similar to what I've seen going on in Canada. Minnesota has restricted their dispensaries and production. The production is restricted to 3 facilities, and they can only produce edible forms of cannabis. Again, another very smart activity. A lot of states didn't take that extra state. And what's the most common use of cannabis? Smoking. So again, there's an irony here, going back to the government and the legal process. Many of these same governors were involved in the lawsuits that state Medicaid programs had against big tobacco and all the damage that tobacco caused to smokers. To now legalize something where we're not restricting its use, and we know that some individuals will be smoking it, doesn't really go hand in hand with all the other legislation. So again, kudos to Connecticut and Minnesota, and they're not the only ones. There are a number of states out there. Again, the parallel with the state prescription drug databases. I've seen the states wisely copy best practices when it comes to the database. And that's been a very good thing. That is what has allowed us to actually exchange information oftentimes across state lines, which when we first developed these databases was almost impossible. Today, more and more states are doing that simply because of what we refer to as some of the border cities and municipalities, where if a doctor lives in one state, patients receiving controlled substances across the state line in another state, at one point they couldn't communicate. Now, by copying best practices, we're seeing that all of that change. I'm hoping that we see the same type of result when it comes to cannabis legislation. And we start looking to some of the thought leaders, some of the states that have already adopted best practices, and that those things will spread. So we have state cannabis. So those of you that responded, yes, it's legal in your state, that's a correct statement. But what about the federal government? Go back a few years. Jimmy Carter, for those of you old enough to remember President Carter, when he was campaigning for president, part of his platform was the decriminalization of cannabis, not legalization, but decriminalization. In other words, he felt strongly, as many did at that time and still do, that someone should not be prosecuted for possession and distributing cannabis the same way an individual might be prosecuted for possession and distribution of heroin or fentanyl, illegal fentanyl, something of that nature. Decriminalization was a very different approach than legalization. Legalization is what the states are going through now, which is allowing possession, distribution, etc. So this has been debated now for many, many years. We've seen it go through quite a few different administrations. During the Obama administration, I know there was anticipation that the federal government, both at the DEA and the FDA level, might take action to take cannabis out of that Schedule 1 controlled substance category. So what is a Schedule 1 controlled substance? For those of you that aren't familiar with it, the controlled substance law created 5 schedules of dangerous drugs. The lower the number, the more dangerous the drug. Schedule 1, therefore, is the most dangerous, the most addictive, the greatest potential for abuse and harm. And that's where we see things such as heroin, methamphetamine, drugs of this nature, and cannabis was included in that schedule. Schedule 2, we start seeing the legal drugs, but they also come with a very high risk of abuse. That's where we see the opioids, OxyContin, drugs of this nature, unfortunately, which some that we see so often used in workers' compensation. And then as the schedules increase in number, the potential for abuse goes down. So the debate has been, did cannabis really belong in Schedule 1? And how do we take it out of Schedule 1? Okay. Processes always seem so simple when you look at it in this way, but in reality, a Schedule 2 drug, although it's still very dangerous, it has an accepted medical use. In the United States, accepted medical use is typically equated to FDA approval, because it's the Federal Food and Drug Administration that's responsible for making sure that drugs are what? Safe and effective. So to get into that accepted medical use category requires approval by the FDA. The FDA has not examined cannabis in this way for a variety of reasons, but ironically, that Schedule 1 categorization really restricted the research into cannabis. It is extremely difficult for a company or a university to possess an illegal substance in order to carry out drug studies. University of Mississippi is one exception. They've had a long-standing relationship with NADA, the National Association on Drug Abuse, and that authorization has allowed them to study certain illegal drugs. But that was just one institution in the entire country. The Obama administration ultimately did not take action to change the scheduling of cannabis. But what they did do was make it possible for more entities, clinical research entities, to have access to cannabis and to begin this study. That was a very important first step. Another thing that happened under the Obama administration is there was a memo, which we're not going to go into a lot of detail on it today, but basically the outcome of it was to instruct the DEA to look the other way. If a state was willing to legalize cannabis, this memo was basically saying, so we're not going to worry about that. Fast forward now to the current administration. At a press conference back in April of this year, my administration was characterized as confirming that they were in support of decriminalizing, rescheduling, and certainly legalizing medical marijuana. So the White House definitely has an intent to move forward in this regard, to basically somehow find a way of getting cannabis out of Schedule 1 and legalizing it. So, we'll be watching over the next few years to see what type of activity happens in that regard. But in the meantime, the states are marching forward, doing what they're doing, and that is already impacting workers' compensation as well as others. Another step that came about that is important to continue to move forward with legalization was referred to as the SAFE Act. The SAFE Act is basically preventing a federal banking regulator from penalizing a bank, a depository institution, for providing banking services to a legitimate cannabis-related business. If this act, which has not passed yet, it is basically sitting in committee since last March, but if it passes, the hope is, for the proponents of cannabis use, is that this is going to allow banks to now be able to provide loans to these companies, to allow normal banking transactions with these companies, because without the SAFE Act, none of this is possible. Cannabis is an illegal substance still at the federal level, Schedule 1. Therefore, pharmacists, hospitals, universities, etc., we can't have any involvement with this illegal drug. That has meant that cannabis to date has been a cash-based industry. Now, people are trying to find different ways around that. The SAFE Act, if ultimately passed, would certainly make that a much simpler process. But like I said, it is currently sitting in committee. All we can do is wait and see what the Senate decides to do in this regard. What about the FDA? Well, there are some drugs that are considered to be derivatives of cannabis, and I'm a little bit hesitant to use the phrase synthetic marijuana or synthetic cannabis, simply because synthetic marijuana in the media has taken on an entirely different meaning. It is associated with hallucinogenic drugs known as bath salts, which quite frankly has very little to do with cannabis. But that name, synthetic marijuana, has sort of stuck. When I think of synthetic, I'm simply thinking of something that is man-made. And it is possible to take components of the cannabis plant, alter them, put them through FDA scrutiny, and bring a drug to market that is, in essence, a synthetic cannabis product. Or a better term may be a derivative of cannabis. So some examples of this, I'm sure many of you heard of a drug a few years back, Epidiolex, which is the generic name cannabidiol, which is used to treat seizures. And proponents of legalization have long looked to the use of cannabis for helping those individuals where other seizure medications were ineffective. Then there's also been 3 other drug products that are cannabis related: Marinol, Syndros, and Sesamet. These are all prescription drugs that can be legally prescribed today. Most of the last ones are typically used to treat nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy, something of that nature. So these are traditional drugs that have gone through the process. Now, they're available prescription only. They are controlled substances, but I believe they all fall into schedules 3 through 5, not 2, certainly not 1. And something that we found very interesting. One would think that a drug derived from cannabis would have the same potential for abuse as cannabis itself. It's not what we're seeing. We see very little indication that these drugs are being abused, which is a good thing. Begs the question, though, why not? Well, when an individual is using cannabis for recreational purposes, and the intent is, of course, to experience that high, the euphoria that it creates, by smoking that drug, inhaling it, the individual can control, they're basically setting their own dose. They can control the amount that they're consuming, and inhaling something into one's lungs gets it into the system almost as fast as an injection, which also increases the high that it creates. Whereas when you take a pill, you don't have the ability to self-regulate the dosing. You swallow the pill, it dissolves, is slowly absorbed into your system. It helps with the seizures, or it helps with the nausea and the vomiting, and the euphoric effect is minimal. So we're not seeing the risk with misuse and abuse when it comes to these FDA-approved drugs, which, as I said, of course, is a good thing. So brings us to the question now of that Obama administration memo and the DEA. So next polling question: does the DEA still investigate cannabis production? And I'm going to pause for a moment there, Cliff. I'm going to let you let me know as we start getting some results in and how they look.
I'm still waiting. A little slow at the polls today. It's like a trick question, or is it not a trick question, Phil? Is it a
It's not really a
quiz
question, but I'm really interested to see what people think.
Yeah. All right, we got a couple votes coming in. They're still coming in.
Okay.
We're not going to. The polls haven't closed quite yet. A little more participation, Phil. I'll let you know when get a little bit above.
Perfect. I should have asked what part of the country people are viewing from today. East Coast is end of the day. California is still midday.
Yeah, we're lacking a little completeness of data here, Phil. You know how I feel about that. All right, we get about 46% participation. Still coming. Right now at 46% participation, we have 83.3% to answer yes. Does the DEA still investigate cannabis production? So we're at 83% yes.
Okay. All right.
With about 50%.
Okay, very good. Thanks for all of you that responded, and you're absolutely right. The DEA does still investigate cannabis production. That memo that I made reference to did not cancel a DEA domestic cannabis suppression eradication program that was started in 1979. No one ever put an end to that program. And in 2020, those eradication efforts continued. Resources were provided to 127 state and local law enforcement agencies that actively, when they discover the production of illicit cannabis, which at the federal level, all cannabis is illicit, they are putting an end to that production, arresting individuals. And so, as I said, that effort was never stopped. So again, it begs the question, is legal or is it? It is not legal at the federal level yet. Is that time coming? It may be. I would certainly think that every indication says that we're heading in that direction, but it has been a very slow path to get there. In that regard, I hear a phrase that's used quite often, and I'm going to make a statement that sometimes creates a significant amount of debate, but I think it's very important. And that is whether or not physicians can prescribe cannabis in states where it's legal. Well, the short answer to that question is no. A prescription for a controlled substance is something that is heavily governed at the regulatory level, at the state level and federal level. In order to prescribe controlled substances, a prescriber must have a DEA number, which is a federally issued number. It allows the prescriber to prescribe drugs in schedules 2 through 5, not schedule 1. Schedule 1 drugs are considered illegal. And so even though a state may have legalized cannabis, as long as the DEA and FDA consider cannabis a Schedule 1 drug, a doctor cannot prescribe it. Again, takes us back to why cannabis does not show up in a state prescription drug monitoring program. They're not prescription drugs, therefore they're not reported. Legalization at the federal level, even though a decade ago paper I wrote, I was very obviously against legalization. I'm also a very pragmatic. We're at a point now where we've caused so much communication confusion with the state legalization that I think legalization at the federal level is actually an important next step. I do think that that day is coming. It's just a matter of when. Um, Sort of have a little more insight into that, let's look to our neighbor to the north, Canada. In Canada, it has been legal for nationally for quite a period of time. And again, like I called out Minnesota and Connecticut, we can also look to Canada for some best practices. You will hear individuals at My Matrix and other healthcare professionals talk about the fact that, well, a PBM cannot process cannabis until it is legal and has what? An NDC number, a national drug code. The entire processing system for drugs in this country is based on that NDC number. Well, Canada has a very similar system, and they solve that. They don't use NDC numbers, they use DINs, drug identification numbers. But by creating proprietary DINs for cannabis, that is how our sister company, ESI Canada, was able to start processing cannabis in that country. Something very similar could happen here at some point in time. Canada also made sure that they would only cover tablets, drops, and edibles, no smoking or inhaled forms. They restricted the production to very few dispensaries that have to undergo a significant credentialing process. Again, that reminds me of Minnesota. In fact, when I look at Minnesota and Canada in terms of that aspect of the law, I see a lot of similarities, and I think that was a very wise choice. And I'm hoping all states fall into suit and only allow forms other than the smoking or inhaled forms. Credentialing dispensaries, I think, is vital. Before we can start talking about creating networks of dispensaries, we have got to understand what are the consequences to a dispensary if they're not following the best practices. And I've heard different statements in that regard, but it's something that we've got to figure out. Okay, how do we credential a dispensary? What is required? What is the record keeping process? How do we communicate with the rest of healthcare? A lot of questions that need to be answered into that. And then lastly, I think it's important to talk about the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs, the NCPDP. This is a member-driven organization that sets the standards for how PBMs process different legal medications. And so that will have to be part of this process as well. We've got to have those discussions. Again, we've got to figure out how do we create standards. And Cliff, I think at this point, probably wise for me to hand it over to you because those standards don't exist, which in my mind means the data doesn't exist.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we think about standards and how it helps us interoperate. It helps us take the noise out of our business processes. And I think this is more of an opportunity than something that I get worried about. But it all comes along with what we think of as a pharmacy program. And the foundation of every pharmacy program that's effective is accurate and complete data. There's really not much of an exception there. I think the simplest way to describe what we mean as complete data is if you think of a spreadsheet, the rows and columns on it. Let's say there's a drug list there. Having lots of rows is great. It gives you a better sample size. But I would argue that just as important to the sample size of data is the number of columns that you have. That tells you more about the drug. It tells you more about what those rows are. And that's very vital to almost every business process within a pharmacy benefits management program, all the way from the very basic processes such as formulary management and plan edits, all the way to the highest, most complex processes like artificial intelligence and advanced clinical analytics. Data completeness about the drugs is essential all the way up the value chain from the bottom to the top. So that's a real important thing. Now, medical cannabis, this shouldn't be an exception. We have to drive toward the solution to be able to keep it at a feature parity level with all our other medications and all the other drugs that we have in the domain. Phil just mentioned it. The number one thing on the list is the most granular element in pharmacy, when we look at drugs and medications, is National Drug Code, NDC. That is absolutely essential for us to do everything, from formulary to those analytics I mentioned. So we have to figure out a way to get NDCs on these medical cannabis entities. The next one is this is the business must flow, right, Phil? And to do that, right now, our designated way of determining pricing is looking at a drug, whether it's brand or generic. That's the biggest influencer on the pricing that we use today, as well as other things. So we have to figure out if there's going to be a brand or generic. And Phil and I have talked about this a bit, and maybe there isn't a brand or generic medicinal cannabis entity, and we have to come up with a third one, which will be fun. So brand and generic, what is it? Is it either or neither of them? So interesting. Same thing when we start thinking about opioids. There is a euphoric effect, obviously, with cannabis, and there's also the potential for abuse. So this is why we have what we call morphine equivalency with opioids. In other words, we look at an opioid product and we determine whether it has a higher potency level than morphine or less. And this is where we get this term MED, or morphine equivalent dose, which is very, very important, especially when we're talking about those more advanced clinical analytics that we use to determine patients that are candidate for interventions or some other alternate therapy, weaning and step therapy, so on. Morphine equivalence is sort of like our really key to the information with opioids. Do we have something similar for cannabis yet? I don't think so, and I think we're going to need to, so we can properly manage these patients and their regimen. So that's a big one. And then finally, just on this list, which is, I'm going to admit, is a very short tip of the iceberg wish list slash I'll say a to-do list to start thinking, are some of the other elements of drugs that we look at. And these units of measure are things like day supply, which is essential to knowing what the duration, if the drug is taken as recommended, what's the duration of the drug utilized by the patient. Very, very important measure. Also quantity. So we need quantity for pricing. We need quantity to determine potency. Super important. But again, this is a very abridged list, a to-do list, as I like to call it, but the very tip of the iceberg. And we need to manage our expectations, but also we need to push hard on standards and bring the whole industry together to figure out how to do this. It's very essential. So it's not just useful, I think it's essential. And this is a short list. All right, look at the next slide. All right, so at this point, you've probably heard or read studies that are claiming that cannabis use, medicinally or recreationally, leads to less opioid abuse or utilization. So there's arguments on both sides. There studies will say, okay, more cannabis, less opioids; more cannabis, no change in opioids, or more opioids, or there's several different studies. And as I said, you can read them. So really, what I think the question is there a causative property here? Is the consumption of cannabis causing a greater use of opioid utilization, a decreased use of opioid utilization, or no effect at all? I mean, there could be a non-causative effect completely, or just a pure correlative effect. So we put our data to the test, and this is a very quick and I would call it somewhat limited study based on a very large scale of data where we don't yet know that our patients are moving from opioids to cannabis, or cannabis and opioids. We don't have the information because I just showed you in the previous slide. We don't have the data yet. And I think if you want to do a very deep study, you would have to do a lot of interviews and dig in a lot of places that aren't really available to all of us at the moment. But what we did was we segmented 3 areas of data, three segments. We looked at 2 states, Colorado and New Mexico. Colorado, which has both medicinal and recreational marijuana use since 2000 and 2012 respectively. And then we also segmented New Mexico, which approved medicinal use in 2007. And the third segment are the rest of the states, the rest of the United States. And what we're measuring is really 2 things. We're looking at the number of patients, or the penetration of patients in our book that were consuming opioids. And not only just the percentage of patients consuming opioids, but the change over time. So we're looking at multiple years. It's a temporal list of years from 2017 to 2020. And across the list, we're measuring the average change per year, year over year, as well as the penetration in each year. What we found was not a lot of difference between the Colorado and the New Mexico states and the rest of the United States. Not a whole lot of difference. Average is really close between each other within 1 percentage point. So what does this mean? Does this mean opioid utilization is not being affected by marijuana or not? And I have to be full disclosure here with you is that we've seen a decrease in opioid utilization over the past few years. This is very obvious. We talk about a lot in conferences. It's in the data. Almost everyone reports this. So with that, we get what we call data inertia. In other words, there's a momentum push to downward on opioid utilization. In this case, the number of patients using opioids for many reasons. And there's been a lot of contributions into the success. So we have to have a caveat a little bit with this. In other words, I'm not going to say the jury's in or out yet. And the reason is because of that inertia. When you have that inertia, you lose other elements that could be influencing your trends. Things like even seasonality, or in this case, maybe cannabis use. But I think this is a step. There's a first step. And what we're going to do is keep a big eye on this, and we're going to monitor it for the domain and keep you up to date on what we find. It's a fascinating start, and I think we have a lot more to go here. But Phil, you and I talk about this all the time. I think this is fascinating. I think we're going to keep looking for that causative effect if it exists, or disproving that it does. What do you think?
First of all, I love the way you presented this. When I look at what you've done here, Cliff, you have taken a limited amount of data, because as I pointed out early on, data on cannabis use is very hard to come by. It is not like a prescription drug at all. And yet you were able to take other factors, such as when cannabis was legalized in these states, so that we had a proven history in those states. You were able to look at the opioid utilization there. And although I very much appreciate the fact that, yes, there are many factors driving down the use of opioids, I would certainly have expected that if cannabis was one of those factors, then I would have expected to see opioid utilization in Colorado and New Mexico to have declined at a faster pace than the rest of the country. Right. And I'm not seeing that. But there is, of course, a huge missing element. And if I were John Rooser or Alex Swedlow right now, I'd be looking at this and thinking, okay, how do we get to the next level of data? Yeah. That is the impact on the individual. And I know from talking with our clients, we have seen in situations where they will talk about individuals that have started using cannabis and their opioid utilization goes away. Mm-hmm. But those are one-off examples. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, there are also examples of patients who are using both opioids and cannabis, which is not a good combination. So until we have that patient-level data, it's going to be very hard to do much more than what you have presented here. But again, I think this was an excellent way for today of sort of looking at that question. There was a study done, quite a few actually, but one in particular a few years back that drew a very clear conclusion that cannabis use decreased reliance on opioids. However, it was not a workers' compensation study. Mm-hmm. My fear that I'll share with you and the audience is that all too often in workers' compensation, what I see is additive therapy. Mm. In other words, prescribers add drugs on to what these patients are taking and rarely go back and deprescribe another drug or discontinue another drug. Great example being compounds. Years ago, I heard the same thing from proponents of compounds, is that, if a patient's in pain, the compound can decrease their needs for opioids. I didn't see that in the data at all at the patient level. Instead, what I saw was patients taking opioids would start taking compounds, and then they were taking both and driving cost up even further with no benefit to outcomes. So my fear is that with cannabis, if it's not managed correctly, if it is not a true prescription drug, we run the risk of having the same type of consequences. And with that, I think we're going to turn it over to Q&A. I'm going to end the slide presentation at this time and rejoin you back in the green room. Here we are. So I'm going to start reading some of the question. So here's a good one. Some of these have been coming in for a little while now, so I'll back up a little ways. Question is, can producers, and I'm assuming by producers that is meant that people that are growing marijuana, can they be arrested and fined even in medically approved states? Yes, they can. This would be a federal case because at the federal level, cannabis is an illegal Schedule I controlled substance. So the activity of the DEA has not ceased, and no one has told them to stop that particular aspect of what they do. Another question. If approved for medicinal usage by a state, is there any regulation of the growers for consistency of the product like the FDA regulates for prescription medications? Thank you to the individual that sent that prescription in. This is something that I have been talking about for years. Plant sources of medicinal products are vital. In fact, I would be so bold as to say all the most potent drugs on the market today were originally derived from a plant source. Morphine, derived from the opium poppy. Insulin, obviously a natural product. Things like Coumadin or warfarin, derived from clover and other sources, powerful anticoagulant. So obtaining drugs from natural sources is not unusual. But let me tell a little story that some of you have probably heard me tell in the past. What I see with medical cannabis and state legalization is like a giant 200-year step backwards in medical science. So why am I saying that? Well, let's go back 200 years ago. Let's talk about a patient totally unrelated to workers' compensation. A patient goes into their physician. They have fatigue, shortness of breath, extreme swelling in the extremities. Physician examines them, diagnoses them with a condition known back then as dropsy, recommends that they obtain a plant known as foxglove, that they brew a tea from the foxglove, and that should help them. Now, one of three things is going to happen when they consume that tea. One, is going to be too weak and it will do nothing at all. Two, is going to be just right and it's actually going to help improve the symptoms of dropsy. Or three, it's going to kill them because it is extremely potent and an overdose is fatal. What's missing there? Quality control. When you brew a tea from a plant, there is no quality control. You don't know how strong one plant is compared to another. That is where we are with cannabis production. We don't know how strong one is to the other. And for the record, dropsy today is known as congestive heart failure. The most common treatment is a very old drug known as digoxin, which is a purified form of digitalis, which comes from foxglove. So plants are natural sources of medicinal products, but we have to have quality control. We have to understand the dosing, and you just can't get that when you're using the raw substance. That's my concern about cannabis. Another statement I make quite often is to policymakers, if you have any questions about legalization of cannabis, call an ER physician in Colorado and ask them what they think about it since it's been legal for all this time. It is not a good thing to be an ER physician in Colorado where people are going for cannabis vacations, marijuana vacations. The marijuana being produced in Colorado is a lot more potent than what it used to be. And individuals that aren't used to that, when they're exposed to it, can do one of two things. It can cause a psychotic break, and it also causes projectile vomiting, which sends these people to the ER. And to the person that asked this question, that's why this is so valid. There is not a requirement to have consistency of product. It's impossible when it comes to a plant. Now, can we have certain strains that are lower in potency or lower in the concentration of THC, the active ingredient in cannabis? Yes, we can. But I still would ask the question of who's policing that? Who's making sure that that particular dispensary, when they say they're providing that low THC product, how do we know that's the case? Practice of pharmacy, there's regulations in place, there's requirements, the FDA, DEA, etc. When it comes to these dispensaries, the state infrastructure has not developed to that level yet. And at the state level, I personally find it hard to believe that they will be able to. This is why we need some type of decision from the federal government. Cliff, forgive me, I've been doing a lot of talking here. Any thoughts from you on these subjects?
No, I think we live in an environment now, it's 2021. So when you start thinking about blockchain, supply chain, we have all the facilities in place to build this out very quickly. I don't believe there's a lot of invention needed to be able to apply a blockchain or supply chain model from the ground to the hand to know where it came from, and then apply some very simple principles that have been around for 200 years to determine potency. I don't know where the blockage is, but I will tell you, just from a technology standpoint, I don't believe that we have those. I don't believe that we have anything blocking us from being able to actually pull this off other than ourselves.
Okay, very good. I don't believe we have any more questions coming in. So if there are, I think most of you guys in the audience know how to get in touch with myself or Cliff. Please email us. You can email marketing rclinical@mymatrix.com, and you definitely will get an answer. We appreciate you joining us today, and thank you all very much. Cliff, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Phil. Pleasure as usual. Be well, everyone.